Hello, High Rock. Welcome to our daily devotional. During this season of Lent, we are continuing through the Gospel of Mark on a journey toward the cross. And today we continue a passage that we started yesterday. It's actually, I said 2 parts yesterday. Really, technically, it's 3 parts. And we are in the second of 3 parts where Jesus is talking about things to come and even dipping into something we might call the end times. So we are in Mark chapter 13, verses 14 through 27. And Michael, would you read this for us, please?
Hear the word of the Lord. The day is coming when you will see the sacrilegious object that causes desecration, standing where he should not be. Reader, pay attention. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills. A person out on the deck of a roof must not go down into the house to pack. A person out in the field must not return even to get a coat. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for nursing mothers in those days. And pray that your flight will not be in winter. For there will be greater anguish in those days than at any time since God created the world, and it will never be so great again. In fact, unless the Lord shortens that time of calamity, not a single person will survive. But for the sake of his chosen ones, he has shortened those days. Then, if anyone tells you, "Look, here's the Messiah," or "There he is," don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform signs and wonders so as to deceive, if possible, even God's chosen ones. Watch out. I've warned you about this ahead of time. At that time, after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then everyone will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with great power and glory. And he will send out his angels to gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of the earth and heaven. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Well, as Dave and I talked about this passage yesterday, one of the ideas that we mentioned was simply how in biblical prophecy, there's often kind of a short term or an immediate fulfillment of a prophecy, and then a more distant, even larger fulfillment of that same prophecy. And imagine this prophecy as like a mountain. And there are 2 mountains. We see these 2 mountains. There's this immediate mountain and a distant mountain. But what we don't see is the valley between them. We don't see how far they're separated, by perspective. For instance, the prophecy about Emmanuel, God with us, that we, celebrate at Christmas. And that's a prophecy that had an immediate fulfillment in Old Testament times. But then there was this long delay, this long gap to where there was an even greater fulfillment of God being with us in a literal way with Jesus, God in the flesh, entering into the world. So it was this greater fulfillment after a great period of time. And so there's this kind of indeterminacy in biblical prophecy. Maybe one way you can think of it is because God isn't really interested in giving us a roadmap of the future. Prophecy, quite often, probably most of the time, rather than trying to give us a vision of the future, is really to lend credibility or lend authority to other words that are spoken, other teachings that are spoken, or people who are speaking on behalf of God. And they give confirmation so that in retrospect you can look and say, oh, I see how this is all being fulfilled. Whereas looking forward, it's not so easy to see, and maybe sometimes even impossible to see how these things will come together. And I think this prophecy functions in the same way, because most of the things that Mark is talking about here are things that were literally fulfilled in their day. This, I forget how it phrases it here, this I'm used to the words "the abomination that causes desolation." I forget how the NLT puts it here, but this idea of there being something that somebody or something being in the holy place that should not be there, and this is something that's referred to back in Daniel, and Jesus refers to it here. And there are several things that could fulfill this very thing, like in around AD 39 or so, Caligula, the Roman emperor, puts his likeness into the temple, and he declares himself to be divine. So that's an abomination. But maybe even a more direct thing is in AD 66, and this is something we talked briefly about before. There were a group of zealots who took over the temple and slaughtered the priests in the holy place. And so their blood was shed in the temple. And this was obviously a total abomination. Human blood was never meant to be part of this, and the shedding of blood, the taking of life in this way was absolutely forbidden, especially to occur in the holy place. And that's like in AD 66. And then AD 70, the temple gets destroyed. and the Roman emperor sets up the Roman standard, which has the image of the divine Roman emperor on it. So that's like, this another level of that. But it seems to be that in around AD 66 to 70, in that period of time, there were a number of Christians looking to this prophecy who left Jerusalem, left the area, fled the area because they saw these words being fulfilled, that there was this abomination that causes desolation. There was this unholy thing brought into the holy place, and this was a sign of the impending end. And so they left. Another thing here about the false messiahs, there were so many revolts during this time. Josephus, the Jewish historian, writes about this. Josephus is a really interesting character because he was a Jewish general who defected to the Roman side. So he ends up later on writing these books, one of them being the Jewish War. And he's trying to explain to the Roman people, he's trying to explain to the Roman authorities why the Jewish people were so hard to govern, and why they were so offended by some of the standard things that Rome did that didn't lead to extra offense in other places. But he's trying to explain to them why putting the Roman standard in the temple and things like that would produce such a problem. So anyway, he gives us a perspective on this, and gives us a number of the details about other revolts that happened, like the Bar Kokhba revolt and things like that. There were these other people who often claimed to be messiahs, claimed to be the kind of militaristic messiah that Jesus refused to be. Well, they tried to be that, and it just led to the ultimate destruction of not only Jerusalem and the temple, but eventually the entire land of Israel, where people were ripped out of there and scattered to the four winds. So these are things that all happened in this time window. They were things in their immediate future. Some things that happened perhaps just before Mark writes, but many things that happened after Mark was writing. However, not all the things here were immediately fulfilled. And this gets back to that kind of two mountains view where we don't see the valley between them. There are some things here that seem to be pointing to kind of an end times thing. And a lot of people today have read this passage and just see everything being about the end times and don't realize that there are things that were immediately fulfilled. But the end of this passage, where it says that the sun will be darkened and the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, obviously poetic language. What those mean in literal events, I'm not quite sure. But the last part is unmistakable. This is talking about something that only happens at the end. It says, "Then everyone will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with great power and glory," which is a fulfillment of the prophecy, the vision in Daniel 7, going all the way back into the Old Testament. "And he will send out his angels to gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of heaven, of earth and heaven." This idea that his people will be spread over the entire world. So this is obviously something that's pointing to a time in the future, not in the immediate fulfillment of AD 70 and the events that followed. So all of this historical background to say, I think it's really easy to get lost in this. Like, all of that's not necessary to understand. I think it's really easy to get lost in this and miss the main point. And the main point, I think, is that Jesus wins. Things are going to get bad. In fact, they got so bad here in the siege of Jerusalem that people were starving to the point where people wrote about having to eat their own children. That's how bad and how awful things got. That's why, Jesus' prophecies here, it's going to be the worst thing that you've ever seen. And if it was not for God's mercy, if this time had not been shortened, then no one would have survived. And so things will get bad. But to know that as bad as they get, that's not a sign that things are out of control. Instead, God is shepherding history forward to a conclusion, and that conclusion will be, we talked about birth pains last time, what's going to be birthed out of this, that is eventually, is that Jesus will be fully revealed to the entire world, and all people, he will gather all his people to him. And we get to participate in that. Now, there'll be times when, well, in any case, I've already been talking so long. I think just the point I want to bring out of this is that to remember that as bad as things may get, and some people will look at things going on today and say that things are really bad, and just to remember that nothing is a surprise to God, and that we have a role to play during these times, and we need to be in engagement with each other and with God about what that might be. But in the end, the whole purpose of all of history is to bring glory to Jesus and to draw all people to him. Michael, I'm wondering what you see in this passage, and I'm sorry for talking so long.
No, that's okay. I'm glad you took the lead on this one because honestly, there's so much to process here. And
Mm.
actually, in my reading of like literally as I was reading it for this daily Devo, a line stood out to me that I was kind of like, oh, what does that mean? When it talked about when it says things are going to be as bad as they like not since the days of creation. And I was like, huh, that's not what I think about when I think of creation. I like, like we literally use the Bible stories of creation as like these children's stories, like these wonderful, like look how beautiful and perfect and everything was. But it we do forget that it was like creation was birthed out of chaos, like was birthed out of this darkness. Like it says the worst. I mean, in this passage is the worst it's ever been. But out of that came this beauty, came this world, came new life. And I think similarly, like I see that being here, like Jesus is saying these things not to like, I mean, to just kind of paint a real picture so that we're not taken aback or like we're not looking around being like what is going on, but instead to be like, okay, like these are the things that like this is just the reality, this is the world we live in. But the deeper reality, or the deeper truth that Jesus is trying to point us to is exactly what you said, that like Jesus is going to win. Like Jesus, this is ultimately not how the story ends. This is a part of the story, but the way the story ends is with resurrection. And that's like the proof, I think, of like how can we really trust Jesus. It's like we can trust in his life, his death, and his resurrection. Like how things got really bad for him, right? Things got like kind of got to their worst, but what we see through that is this new life, which I think is why like community is so important, why these words are so important, why it's a helpful practice to go back and look at the words of Jesus, look at God's promises, and really allow them to like seep or steep down into who we are and how we live. And I think I'm kind of just processing out loud here, but that those are some of the things I see. And but I think the main thing was like that line of create things being really bad at creation, but ultimately like things bringing forth new life and this so many beautiful things in the world too.
Yeah, it's like Paul saying in Romans 8 that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. Doesn't mean all things are good. In fact, many things are bad, as in the crucifixion. And we call Good Friday only in retrospect. It was the worst Friday in history, and yet we look at it as good because of the goodness that was birthed out of it. And even these events that are detailed here that were fulfilled in the, in AD 66 through 70 and the aftermath, continued this spread of the people of God into the greater world, a spread that hasn't stopped. That the good news about Jesus, in many ways, because of calamities like this, or earlier than that, the persecution of people like Saul, who was chasing down the Christians, that led to the spread of people carrying the good news. So there are in so many ways, so many times in which bad things, God uses them to bring about good. I even think about in my own life some of the events, some of the things that have produced the most good in me, or begun that process of producing the most good in my life, have often been some of the things that I thought were the worst things in my life ever. Doesn't mean I want those bad things in my life, but I do celebrate that God can bring good even out of, maybe even especially out of, the worst things that we might go through. And that's important to remember as individuals and as a community. Michael, I'm wondering if you have any final words and if you'd close us in prayer.
Yeah, I think the last thing I think about is to remember, like, because it's easy to take this story and kind of be like, why are these things happening? Like, why would God allow this to happen? But it's easy to forget the first 13 chapters of the book where Jesus is trying to bring his people to God or usher in God's kingdom in a different way. Like that Jesus is trying to warn them, trying to say, hey, you have like committed this sacrilege. You have made my house of prayer into a den of robbers, like right. And they don't listen. And so I think that's like something for us, I think, is also to pay attention to, is like what are the ways that we like aren't paying attention or aren't listening. But I can pray for us on that. So, Lord, thank you for this word. Thank you for the just telling us the truth, and also giving us the greater truth of the hope that we can find in you. In your name I pray, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks, Michael. Thanks for wading through this passage with me. And everyone, thank you for being with us today. And I hope you're able to join us again tomorrow as we continue in the final section of Jesus speaking about the future. Go in peace.